In the American Old West, fear didn't come from the gun itself. It came from the person holding it. Outlaws weren't just criminals. They were unpredictable men shaped by hunger, revenge, and a world where lawmen were often outnumbered, outgunned, or on someone's payroll. Behind every famous name was a secret, a truth they tried to bury, because the legends people remember are always cleaner than the lives they actually lived. And the more you dig into these stories, the more you realize how many of them were hiding things far darker than the shootouts and robberies that made them famous. Number 1. The Shadow of Billy the Kid. People in the Old West argued endlessly about whether Billy the Kid was a reckless outlaw or a desperate survivor shaped by brutal frontier realities. What's certain is that he became the kind of figure whose reputation traveled faster than any sheriff's horse. Folks whispered his name in saloons, not because he was invincible, but because he had an uncanny way of slipping out of impossible situations. He learned early how quickly alliances broke down, how a lawman one month could quietly morph into a hired hand for powerful ranchers the next, and how the line between justice and revenge blurred the moment money entered the picture. Billy's biggest secret wasn't some dramatic confession. It was the simple truth that he never trusted any side completely. When he crossed Lincoln County's tangled web of factions, he saw that everyone acted like a hero in their own mind, while playing outlaw behind closed doors. His so-called deadly reputation grew precisely because it masked the reality that most gunfights in the West were unpredictable, chaotic, and fueled by misunderstandings. Billy navigated this dangerous world through social instinct rather than brute force. He could charm ranch hands, joke with lawmen, and disappear before anyone realized which group he truly favored that week. He wasn't hiding gold or a love affair. He was hiding his ability to read people so quickly that he usually stayed one step ahead of them. In a land where survival hinged on predicting who would betray you tomorrow, that skill terrified rivals more than any revolver he carried. Number 2. Jesse James behind the mask. Jesse James carefully crafted his own legend, styling himself as a rebel figure, pushing back against a system he felt had crushed his people after the Civil War. Newspapers loved the myth because it sold copies. Farmers repeated it because it gave them a hero who looked like one of their own. But the truth Jesse didn't want widely known was far less glamorous. His robberies weren't Robin Hood gestures. They were strategic attempts to maintain relevance in a world rapidly leaving Confederate veterans behind. Jesse feared being forgotten more than he feared any sheriff trailing him. That insecurity pushed him into risky heists long after his original gang had dissolved or turned against him. What frightened towns the most was the unpredictability. Jesse didn't strike at the richest banks or the most corrupt institutions. He struck wherever he felt it would reinforce his public image. Behind the theatrical flair, he privately battled paranoia. He suspected betrayal even from men who had followed him for years, and his need for absolute loyalty strained every relationship. He didn't hide gold bars or coded maps. He hid the reality that his gang ran on intimidation, and loyalty tests meant to keep everyone too frightened to challenge him. And the more newspapers painted him as a folk hero, the more he embraced this exaggerated persona, until the mask became the man himself. People feared Jesse James, not because of what he did, but because no one knew which version of him would show up next. The dramatic rebel who posed for photographs, or the sharp-edged leader ready to cut ties with anyone who hesitated. Number 3. Butch Cassidy's quiet calculations. While many Old West outlaws acted impulsively, Butch Cassidy took a different approach. He planned things with an almost business-like mindset, turning robberies into calculated operations rather than chaos. He observed towns, timed patrols, studied escape routes, and selected partners based on whether they could follow instructions, not on how fast they could draw a gun. What he kept hidden was how deeply he understood the political and economic changes sweeping through the West. Railroads, banks, and big cattle companies were consolidating power, and Cassidy recognized that the traditional cowboy lifestyle was dying. Instead of fighting this change purely out of anger, he tried to profit from the transition. People feared him because they couldn't pin him down. He wasn't driven by revenge or thrill-seeking, but by a practical understanding that the frontier had rules, and he simply refused to play by the ones written by wealthy investors. Cassidy also concealed how many sympathizers he had among ranchers who felt exploited by corporate interests. Lawmen suspected correctly that local communities often shielded him because he treated everyday workers with respect, paid fairly for supplies, and avoided pointless harm. His secret wasn't buried treasure, but a network of friendships and favors stretching across the region. That made him harder to catch than any gunslinger firing wildly into the night. And while novels later portrayed him as a carefree outlaw, his real strength came from a cold, strategic awareness of how states, companies, and railroads shaped the future of the American West. Number 4. The hidden anger of Belle Starr. Belle Starr stood out in the Old West not because she fired faster or rode harder than men, but because she understood how reputation could be wielded as effectively as any weapon. Newspapers painted her as the bandit queen, but Belle herself knew these sensational stories were often exaggerated or entirely made up. What she actually hid was the frustration of constantly being judged by a world that expected women to stay quiet, obedient, and invisible. She learned early that society punished women for things men did freely every day. So instead of letting the era's rigid expectations bury her, she used the outlaw world to carve her own identity. She mixed confidence with charisma, turning every rumor into fuel for her persona, even when the facts didn't match. What frightened people wasn't her criminal activity. It was her refusal to fit the stereotypes assigned to women in frontier towns. Belle understood how quickly the justice system could be manipulated by land disputes, personal grudges, and wealthy ranch owners. She stayed alive not by overpowering opponents, but by navigating these power structures with sharp insight. She built alliances with outlaws, Native American groups, and even certain lawmen when it served her. Her secret wasn't some scandalous crime. It was her ability to survive in a society that often treated independent women as threats. Many feared her, not for what she did, but because she refused to remain silent or submissive when the entire social structure demanded it. And in the unpredictable psychology of the Old West, that quiet defiance was often more unsettling than any pistol she carried. Number 5. Wyatt Earp's moral gray zones. Wyatt Earp became one of the most recognizable lawmen in American history. But what he tried to hide was how often he operated in territory that blurred the line between justice and personal agenda. Towns needed figures like Earp, confident, firm, and decisive, but they often ignored the complicated factors at play behind the scenes. Wyatt understood that enforcing the law in the Old West had little to do with written codes and everything to do with controlling chaos in rapidly growing towns. He wasn't the flawless hero later stories made him out to be. He carried old grudges, formed alliances with businessmen when it helped his position, and made decisions that sometimes leaned more toward protecting local interests than toward neutral justice. What frightened outlaws wasn't his badge, but his unpredictability. If someone threatened the order he was trying to build, Wyatt reacted decisively, and he didn't hide the fact that he believed certain types of people were incapable of living peacefully in growing frontier communities. His real secret was that he understood the psychology of fear far better than most men wearing badges. He knew intimidation worked faster than legal procedures, and he used that understanding to consolidate his authority. He also hid how many compromises he made behind closed doors. Deals with saloon owners, favors traded with influential ranchers, and silent agreements with business partners, hoping to keep boomtown profits flowing. Wyatt's power came not from his revolver, but from these informal networks, which held towns together more tightly than any official document. And the more successful he became, the more determined he was to keep these gray zone tactics away from public scrutiny. Number 6. Sam Bass. Sam Bass built his entire reputation on one thing. He understood exactly how to strike where lawmen weren't looking, not because he was the most violent gunman or the most unpredictable outlaw, but because he studied how financial shipments moved across the Old West. He learned train schedules the same way a cattleman learns the rhythm of the herd, and that gave him an edge most criminals never had. Bass originally drifted through Texas as a wandering worker, taking odd jobs and picking up rumors about routes, deputies, and banks that struggled with security. He noticed how Wells Fargo wagons relied on predictable routines, how small towns moved their cash into rail depots around the same time each month, and how most lawmen were exhausted from chasing stagecoach robbers across long distances. His biggest hit, the Union Pacific heist near Big Springs, proved how far planning could take him. The gang forced the train crew to open the safes, scooped up tens of thousands in gold coins, and disappeared before local law could organize a response. What Sam tried to hide was the reason he never stayed long in one place. The public picture painted him as a bold outlaw, always ready for a showdown, but he actually avoided gunfights. He preferred small towns because they offered anonymity. One new face in a saloon didn't matter. But what he didn't expect was how quickly the Texas Rangers learned his patterns. They didn't chase him randomly. They calculated his movements the same way he once calculated train shipments. Bass kept trying to stay ahead, yet every campfire conversation he shared with strangers, every horse buyer he dealt with, every bottle he opened in a saloon chipped away at his invisibility. When the Rangers finally cornered him in Round Rock, he wasn't in the middle of some legendary shootout. He was caught off guard by their patience. He had built a career on studying others, but he underestimated how thoroughly lawmen could study him. That was the secret he never wanted the world to know. He wasn't untouchable. He was simply ahead for a little while, and the clock eventually caught up. Number 7. El Fuego Baca. El Fuego wasn't a typical Old West figure. He didn't ride around seeking glory, or jumping into every conflict. He slipped into dangerous situations because nobody else wanted to face them. Baca grew up in New Mexico territory at a time when American settlers, Mexican families, and native communities lived in a constant swirl of uneasy tensions. By the time he was a young man, the region was full of wandering cowboys who believed they could do anything without consequences. Drunken shootouts, intimidation, and land disputes became everyday life, especially around Frisco Plaza. El Fuego stepped into this chaos long before he earned a badge. When he finally did, he embraced the lawman role differently from most. He didn't chase criminals across states or race through the desert in dramatic fashion. He did something more direct. He planted himself in the middle of trouble and refused to move. The standoff that defined him, the one where nearly 80 cowboys surrounded him in a tiny jacal, wasn't just a display of grit. It was a message that frightened every outlaw who heard the story. He lasted through a barrage of gunfire for hours, forcing his attackers to realize he wouldn't back down even if the odds were absurdly against him. The secret he tried to hide was that he wasn't made of stone. After the siege, people turned him into a legend, someone impossible to kill. But Baca carried the weight of every bullet hole in the walls around him. He worried about bringing danger to innocent families, and he hated how quickly violence escalated in frontier towns. He acted fearless because the region needed someone who looked fearless, but his personal letters and later statements suggested he preferred order, negotiation, and respect. Lawmen across the Old West admired him because he didn't build his reputation on boasts or theatrics, he built it on endurance. Criminals feared him because he represented the thing they tried to escape, consequences that refused to bend. Number 8. Cherokee Bill. Cherokee Bill was one of the most unpredictable outlaws to ever move through the Indian Territory. Unlike many criminals who slipped into the outlaw life gradually, Bill seemed to adopt violence early and without hesitation. Some blamed family turmoil, others blamed the chaotic environment of the territory, where jurisdictional confusion made crime easy to commit and difficult to punish. Whatever the reason, by the time he was a teenager, he had developed a reputation that made both settlers and native communities nervous. Bill didn't operate like Jesse James or the Daltons, who at least attempted careful planning. Cherokee Bill relied on sudden action, raw aggression, and fear. He robbed stores, confronted rivals, and drifted between gang alliances, creating a trail that forced U.S. Marshals to reorganize their entire strategy. The secrecy behind his brutality came from something few talked about openly. Bill rarely robbed for survival or strategy. He acted out of impulse, frustration, and anger that ran deeper than any one event. Many witnesses described him as calm until something snapped. Then he moved faster than anyone expected. Lawmen hated dealing with outlaws who couldn't be predicted. They could track a stagecoach robber who relied on schedules or a bank thief who studied security patterns. They couldn't strategize around someone who created chaos for its own sake. Bill's biggest secret was his fear of being forgotten. Underneath the violence was a young man who wanted to be seen as powerful in a world where he felt cornered by cultural tensions, shifting politics, and the loss of identity many native families faced. His crimes were destructive, but they were also attempts to project control in a time when control was slipping away from entire communities. When the marshals finally caught him, it wasn't because he slowed down. He simply misjudged how quickly the federal presence in the territory was expanding. His downfall reminded other outlaws that chaos might intimidate towns, but it couldn't outrun a government determined to restore stability. Number 9. John Wesley Hardin. Hardin's name spread across the Old West long before many towns had proper sheriffs, and his reputation grew so large that even people who never saw him believed he was unstoppable. Hardin moved through Texas like a walking storm, leaving stories behind that blurred the line between fact and legend. Some tales exaggerated his actions, but even the documented ones painted a picture of a man who reacted to threats with immediate and overwhelming force. What he tried to keep hidden, though, was how much his early environment shaped him. Texas in the post-Civil War years was a powder keg. Former soldiers, displaced families, cattle rustlers, and new settlers all collided in a world where law enforcement struggled to keep up. Hardin was young, impulsive, and raised in a culture where defending one's honor mattered deeply. Once he tasted notoriety, he couldn't escape it. Every confrontation became another chapter. People spread around campfires, even when he didn't want the attention. Hardin's secret was the burden of his own reputation. By the time he was in his 20s, he realized he had become a target. Lawmen didn't pursue him just to enforce the law. They pursued him because capturing Hardin meant proving they were among the toughest in the West. Outlaws didn't challenge him for survival. They challenged him for bragging rights. Even his attempts to lay low teaching school under an alias, drifting between states, or living quietly fell apart because his fame followed him like a shadow. When the Texas Rangers finally caught him aboard a train in Pensacola, they didn't face the unstoppable figure of legend. They found a tired man who knew the law would catch up eventually. His legacy terrified the Old West not because he was indestructible, but because he showed how quickly one violent moment could spiral into a lifetime of running. Number 10. Pearl Hart. Pearl Hart broke nearly every stereotype the Old West had about outlaws. She wasn't a gunslinger chasing glory, or a hardened desperado raised on the frontier. She came from a world of stage shows, restless travel, and struggling to carve out an independent life in a society that didn't expect women to take charge. When life dealt her one setback after another, failed relationships, unstable jobs, and financial traps, she drifted toward the one path that gave her a sense of control: crime. The stagecoach robbery she committed with Joe Boot became famous not because it was the largest heist, but because no one expected a woman to pull it off so boldly. Pearl used charm, improvisation, and a strange mix of confidence and desperation to take over the stage and then vanish into the Arizona desert. What she tried hardest to hide was the uncertainty behind her decisions. Pearl wasn't interested in a long outlaw career. She didn't have a gang, a network, or a plan for living on the run. The robbery was partly a survival move, partly a rebellion against a world that had boxed her into roles she despised. When she was captured, reporters flocked to her, fascinated by the contradiction she embodied. An outlaw who didn't fit the Old West's mythology. She knew how to play into that fascination, giving interviews, posing for photographs, and turning her arrest into a spectacle that made her seem far more dangerous than she actually was. Lawmen feared her in a different way. Not because she was violent, but because her case challenged everything the justice system thought it understood about criminals on the frontier. She forced the Old West to admit that danger didn't always come in the form of rough-looking cowboys or notorious gunmen. Sometimes it came from someone who simply refused to stay in the place society assigned them. The secret Pearl kept close was how fragile her freedom really was. She never learned the long-term strategies other outlaws used, and once the courts tightened around her, she couldn't escape the consequences. Her story became a reminder that the Old West wasn't just a battleground of lawmen and gunfighters, but a place where ordinary people could snap under pressure and cross lines they never imagined.